There is a job in America today that pays a median of more than $103,000 a year and requires only a high school diploma to begin. It is one of the most invisible jobs in the entire country, hidden inside windowless rooms that almost no member of the public will ever see. It is not a tech job. It is not finance. And it is not medicine. And yet the entire modern world would collapse within seconds if these workers walked away. No child grows up dreaming of this work. No guidance counselor ever mentions it, and almost no one outside the power industry even knows it exists. You have flipped a light switch your entire life without ever once wondering who, in that exact moment, made sure the power was there to answer it. And yet, a fully trained worker in this trade out-earns the average lawyer, the average accountant, and the overwhelming majority of college graduates. He earns it with no college degree, no student debt, and no 4 years of tuition, having been paid a real and rising wage from his first day of training. The job is the power distributor and dispatcher, the person who controls the flow of electricity across the grid in real time, every second of every day. According to the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, the median wage for this group of workers was $103,000 in 2024. That is more than double the median wage for all American workers, which sat at roughly $50,000 in that very same working year. The workers with the most advanced skills, especially those who master the control software of the grid, can climb well past $130,000. There are only about 46,000 of these workers in the entire country, and a much smaller number who specialize purely in controlling the grid. To put that in perspective, that is a tiny workforce for a job that quite literally holds the power supply of the entire nation in its hands. And here is the part that almost no one understands, the part hidden inside the control rooms of every electric utility in the entire nation. Electricity is unlike almost everything else we buy because it cannot be easily stored, and it must be produced at the exact instant it is used. When you switch on a kettle, a power plant somewhere must instantly produce a little more electricity to answer that demand in the very same second. Multiply that single kettle by hundreds of millions of devices switching on and off at random, all day and all night, across an entire continent. At every moment of every day, the amount of electricity generated must perfectly match the amount being consumed, or the entire grid begins to fail. If supply and demand fall out of balance, even slightly, the result can be a blackout that plunges millions of people into darkness within seconds. Someone has to keep that balance every second around the clock. And that someone is the power dispatcher, the hidden air traffic controller of electricity. Welcome to Forgotten Trades Vault. Before we open this vault, hit subscribe so the next archive finds its way back to you. The archive opens, as it so often does, deep in the history of the electrified age. To understand why this job pays so well today, we have to go back to the early decades of the 20th century, when the grid was first taking shape. In the earliest days of electric power, every power plant served only its own small local area, with no connection to any other plant or any other city. Each little system stood alone, and if a single plant failed, the homes and businesses it served simply went dark until that one plant was repaired. But engineers soon realized that connecting these separate systems together made the whole far stronger than any of its individual and isolated parts. If the plants were linked, then a failure in one place could be covered instantly by power flowing in from another, and the lights would stay on. And so, across the 1920s and 30s, the separate power systems of America were slowly woven together into vast interconnected grids. By linking the plants, the utilities could share power, balance their loads, and survive the failure of any single plant without leaving anyone in the dark. It was one of the great engineering achievements of the century, and it quietly built the reliable electric backbone that the entire modern economy now rests upon. But this new interconnected grid created a brand new and enormous problem that had never existed when each plant stood completely alone. Now, with everything connected, the flow of power across the entire network had to be watched, balanced, and controlled from a central point of command. A single mistake, a single overloaded line, or a single unbalanced moment could now ripple outward and bring down an entire region instead of one town. And so a new kind of worker was born, a worker who sat at the center of the grid and held the balance of an entire region in his hands. The power dispatcher became the human mind at the controls of the grid, watching the flow of electricity and adjusting it constantly to keep it stable. The danger of getting it wrong was made terrifyingly clear in November of 1965, in one of the most famous failures in American history. On that night, a single misconfigured protective relay near Niagara Falls tripped, and within minutes, a cascading failure swept across the entire Northeast. More than 30 million people across several states and parts of Canada were plunged into darkness in what became known as the Great Northeast Blackout. Trains stopped in their tunnels, elevators froze between floors, and a vast region of the most powerful nation on Earth went suddenly and completely dark. That single event proved how fragile the interconnected grid could be, and how absolutely essential it was to control it with skill, care, and constant attention. In the years that followed, the entire system of grid control was rebuilt, professionalized, and equipped with far better tools and far better trained workers. The modern power dispatcher emerged from that effort, a highly trained specialist who sits at a wall of screens and governs the flow of power in real time. He monitors the entire grid at once. He balances generation against demand, and he reroutes power instantly around any failure before it can spread. He is, in every real sense, the air traffic controller of electricity, except that his mistakes are measured not in one aircraft but in entire darkened cities. He issues the switching orders that isolate damaged equipment, and he coordinates the response whenever a storm or an accident threatens the network. He sits before a wall of glowing screens that map the entire grid, watching numbers and lines that tell him, second by second, whether the system is healthy. When something goes wrong, he may have only seconds to act, rerouting power and shedding load to stop a small failure from becoming a regional catastrophe. This is not a job that tolerates panic, distraction, or hesitation, because a single slow or wrong decision can cascade into a blackout for millions, and precisely because the work is so critical, so high pressure, and so absolutely essential, it has always paid extremely well to those who can do it. So if this job pays so well, and if the skill is so rare, and if the work is so essential, then one obvious question remains. Why has almost no one heard of it, and why does almost no young American ever consider sitting at the controls of the grid for a living? The answer is the same answer that explains so many of the jobs we have opened in this archive across the entire series. It was not hidden by the market, and it was not hidden by any lack of demand, because the grid must be controlled every second of every single day. It was hidden, first, by the same college obsession that buried so many other excellent and well-paying careers across the entire country. Starting in the 1970s and 80s, American high schools began pushing every single student toward a 4-year college degree. The guidance counselors were retrained to treat college as the only respectable path, and every other route was quietly relabeled as a lesser choice. A teenager who was calm under pressure, sharp with systems, and able to focus for hours was simply told to go and study for a generic degree. No one told him that he could earn 6 figures controlling the power grid with nothing but a high school diploma and years of paid training. The counselors did not know it, the teachers did not know it, and the parents, raised on the very same college message, did not know it either. But this job was buried even deeper than most, for a second and very simple reason. which is that it is almost completely invisible. A lineman is seen on every street, and an elevator is ridden every day, but the power dispatcher works hidden inside a sealed and secure control center. The public never sees the room, never sees the worker, and never imagines that such a job even exists, let alone that it pays a six-figure salary. You cannot dream of a career you have never seen, and almost no one has ever seen the inside of a grid control center in their entire life. And so, the trade became invisible twice over, hidden by the college message and hidden by the simple fact that its work happens out of public sight. Meanwhile, the workers who run these control rooms kept getting older, year after year, with very few young people arriving to replace them. Now, here is where we must be honest, because this trade is different from the others we have opened in one very important way. The total number of these jobs is actually projected to shrink slightly over the coming decade, as automation handles more of the simple routine tasks. But that single fact hides a much more interesting and much more hopeful truth for the right person who is willing to look a little closer. Even as the total number shrinks, the Bureau of Labor Statistics still projects thousands of openings every single year for the next decade. Almost all of those openings come from the wave of experienced workers now reaching retirement age and leaving the control room for good. Roughly 1 in 4 skilled energy workers in America is now over the age of 55, and that entire generation is heading toward retirement at once. As they retire, they take decades of irreplaceable experience with them, and the utilities are struggling to find and train the people to replace them. At the very same time, the grid itself is becoming far more complex, not less, as it absorbs solar power, wind power, and giant new battery systems. The old grid had a few large and predictable power plants, but the new grid has thousands of small and variable sources that come and go with the weather. Balancing a grid full of variable renewable energy is far harder than balancing the old, steady grid, and it demands more skill from the people who control it. And on top of that, the explosion of data centers and artificial intelligence is driving electricity demand upward faster than it has grown in decades. The work is changing, the tools are changing, and the most skilled dispatchers are becoming more valuable, not less, even as the simplest tasks are automated. So let us talk about how a person actually enters this trade today, because the path is real, it is open, and it is far more reachable than you think. You do not need a college degree, you do not need a background in engineering, and you do not need to take on a single dollar of student debt. Most dispatchers begin in another role at an electric utility, often as a plant operator or a field worker, and learn the system from the ground up. This means the door into this career often runs through the other power trades, so a lineman or a plant operator can climb into the control room over time. The utility then trains them extensively in-house, moving them step by step toward the control room as they prove their skill and their judgment. For grid system operators, there is also a required certification from the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, the body that governs grid reliability. That certification is earned through study and examination, not through a 4-year degree, and the training is provided and paid for by the employer. Throughout that entire training period, the worker earns a real and rising salary, never once paying tuition to sit in a classroom for the privilege. By the time a college graduate is finishing a 4-year degree, often buried under tens of thousands of dollars of student loan debt, the trainee dispatcher has no debt at all, has years of paid experience already behind him, and is climbing toward a salary well above 6 figures. The work demands calm nerves, sharp focus, and the willingness to work nights, weekends, and holidays, because the grid never sleeps and never stops. But for the right person, the steady and focused person who thrives on responsibility, it is one of the most secure and best paid jobs in America. This is not a glamorous trade, and it will never be a famous one. And that is exactly the reason it has stayed hidden for so very long. This is a quiet trade, an invisible trade, and a trade that quietly pays a six-figure salary to the people who keep the lights on for everyone else. It cannot be sent overseas because the American grid must be controlled from inside America by people trusted with the security of the entire system. It cannot be fully automated away because when the grid faces a crisis it has never seen before, it still takes a calm human mind to save it. The skill was not buried by time, and it was not buried by technology, because the grid it controls only grows more complex with every passing year. It was buried by a culture that forgot how to value the people who sit in the dark, unseen, holding the balance of the entire electric world steady. The trades they hid, the wages they buried, the doors they never told you were open. If you are young and choosing a path, or if you know someone who is, this is the kind of door worth walking up to and knocking on yourself. If this vault opened a door for you, leave a comment with the trade you want this archive to open next. The vaults will keep opening, and the next high-paying secret is waiting just behind the next door. The next vault opens soon.